Journey on, the magic lies within the trails we ride. Move along, the lightness you seek is by your side. And everything that
Greetings, horse enthusiasts around the world. I'm Andrew A. Turnbull, and this is IHF Live. Tonight, we welcome my fellow Californian, Warwick Schiller of Warwick Schiller Attuned Horsemanship. He's a lifelong equestrian of various disciplines, and he moved from his home country of Australia in his 20s to the United States in order to pursue his dream of training horses. He focused his competitive efforts on reining and becoming a National Reining Horse Association Reserve World Champion, and he represented Australia in the 2010 and 2018 World Equestrian Games. His unique ability to convey his knowledge to others became apparent when he successfully went on to coach individuals who garnered coveted reining titles such as NRHA World Champions, NRHA Rookies of the Year, Australian Champions, US Champions, and a fellow WEG team member. Warwick's love of storytelling, combined with the thousands of hours he spent with some of the best horse trainers and a wide variety of horses, has helped him build a well-earned reputation for being among the top professional horsemen and now one of the leading relationship-based horsemanship influencers on the planet. He has created an extensive collection of training videos. He offers clinics. He's got a popular podcast. He's a regular headliner and clinician at horse expos across America. And he recently released his book, Principles of Training. Warwick's positive support for his followers is ever apparent in his willingness to engage with people online and in person in a respectful, empathetic manner. Warwick derives his success from his success of his customers. Welcome, Warwick. How are you there mid-state here in California on your ranch in Paso Robles?
Hey, Andrew, how's it going? Good to be here.
You know, we were talking about, like, where do we start when you talk about a lifetime and a lifetime with horses? You know, originally I thought I was going to go all the way back to the beginning, but we were afraid we would lose some of the opportunity in the back. So I'm going to go to kind of where you want to start. I'm going to ask you about your influencers in horsemanship early on, and then maybe we'll talk about from when you transitioned over to joining us here in the United States.
Well, you know, my father, I guess, was a big influence as a kid. You know, I grew up on a 1,200-acre sheep and wheat farm. I don't remember when I started riding, probably 7 or 8, maybe 7, somewhere in there. We went to pony club, so I guess we had some pony club instructors, but pretty much, you know, my father, I guess, is the one that guided us with the horses. And, you know, and Dad was one of those guys that, you know, there weren't any clinics or videos or anything at the time. He was pretty much self-taught, but he was pretty natural at the whole thing. Like, you know, things came to him. I don't know. He seemed to get along well with animals, you know.
Well, good. And then tell us about what brought you to the United States.
Well, you know, Dad had a stack of Western Horseman magazines out in the garage, and I used to pore over those things. Like, you know, people are really like these days, or back, you know, 20 years ago, you know, like clinic junkies and DVD junkies and video junkies, and you just watch the videos. We didn't have that back then, so I would read those Western Horsemen from cover to cover to cover to cover. I almost got to the point where I could look at the cover of one, and I could tell you what articles were in it just from the picture on the cover. You know, like I pored over those things, and, you know, it was all, you know, my father rodeoed, so we were around rodeos a lot. So the whole, you know, American, and I guess the Westerns on the TV too, but the whole Western thing really, really intrigued me. So it wasn't just the horses. It wasn't like I wanted to go to England to be a, you know, a jumping rider or something or other. It was the horses of the West sort of thing, that whole Western thing, it really floated my boat.
Wonderful. It's been about 30 years then since you decided to come to the United States, and you got into it, you were drawn to reining, is that right?
Yeah, well, as you know, as kids, we showed horses at like the what we call Western shows, and you show them in all the different events, and the reining was starting to be, well, actually the thing that we had a lot of those shows too was the cutting, and the cutting was the one thing that was a specialized thing where you had to train a cutting horse to do the things. The rest of the events we just kind of did them, and the way that the process to train a cutting horse, I didn't know much about it, but the little bit I knew about, I'm like, that's cool, but we don't have cows. And then the reining was kind of a similar sort of a thing without cows. It was technical enough to where you couldn't just do it. There, you had to train a horse over a long period of time to do it, and it was something that, it was cool. Chicks dig it, sort of thing. And I wanted to. At the time, I worked in a bank in Australia, and it was a nationwide bank. And one of the things they did at the time was they would give you 12 months, what they called leave without pay, which means, if you're young and you want to travel or something like that, you could take 12 months off. And when you came back, they would you would have a job. It might not necessarily be in the same town you lived in, but you would have a job. So I took 12 months leave without pay and came to America. Found a job a couple of weeks. I knew one person in America actually, and found a job pretty a week or so after I got here, and worked for a reining and cow horse trainer for a year. And I just wanted to learn a bit about the reining to go home and train my own horses. I had no aspirations of being a horse trainer. And probably one of the reasons being that I think it was possible. Some people have a great deal of self-confidence and I can do anything. And I was probably the opposite, say in sporting activities or whatever, and they pick two kids to be the captains and they pick someone here and someone there and someone there, someone there. I was kind of towards the end of that. Not being a terribly special kid in any way. I was just happy to be included. I didn't think I was going to be a star or anything. I was happy. And I was the youngest. I've got two older brothers. I was the youngest. So it was kind of like, imagine there too, I was just happy they'd let me play with them, sort of thing. So when I came to America and worked for that trainer for a year, if you want to come back, I'll give you a job because you could do this for a living if you wanted to. And I'd never even considered that. Like I said, some people are full of themselves and they're full of self-confidence and whatever. And I was probably the opposite. And it wasn't until this successful trainer, he's in the Rein Cow Horse Hall of Fame now. He said to me, you could do this for a living if you wanted to.
Nice.
To me, that was kind of a turning point for me because all of a sudden that was possible. I never thought that was possible before. I was kind of prepared to just go back to Australia and work in the bank. And, growing up so I grew up on a farm, but we didn't own the farm. Dad worked there. And basically, the way my family kind of worked was, okay, you go to school, you get a job, you get married, you have kids, you die. That's what there is to life. My father was one of 16 kids. I've got 58 first cousins on dad's side of the family. I don't think one of those 58 first cousins has a college degree. It's not a thing when you grow up in rural Australia.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be funny watching, say, Happy Days on TV, like the dad, what was his name? Howie. He'd say, yes, but he's saving for Richie's college fund. And I used to think, what is a college fund?
Oh.
I mean, I just wasn't growing up in a rural, small country town. That wasn't something you even considered. And basically all you do is you get a job so you can buy a house and have some kids and then it's over, sort of thing. So, I didn't grow up in a family of, or a culture of big thinkers, the first year I was here, I met a girl named Robin, who's now my wife. And I met her earlier in the year, and I chased her for about 10 months, and she ran like a scalded cat, And when I went back to Australia, I had the job offer there, but I went back to Australia, and Robin and I wrote letters to each other. And when I went back to Australia, she kind of missed me chasing her around a little bit. So I had the job offer and Robin was kind of missing me chasing her around. And so I was at home for 6 months and came back in April 1992.
And of course, Robin and your son play a big role in your business today, right?
Yeah, that they do. There's a lot to running any business really, and there's a lot to what we do. And I have my one part that I'm good at, and I'm not good at all the other parts. And luckily, they have the skills to run all the other parts. My wife was in human resources for 25 years, and she said the hardest job she's ever had is managing me.
Wow. Well, I have a sense that because you're just on fire right now, it's probably just coming really fast. Well, let's shift over to the first time that I want to go back to an own personal experience. When I got into relationship-based horsemanship, shortly after I finally got my first horse, I was introduced to Sandy Parker, and Sandy Parker was with the Pearly organization, Pearly Professional. She was a 3-star eventually. Well, I started to go all in. I was a single man. I had Silicon Valley, I was making money. So I had time, money, and I just wanted to go all in with my horse. And so I was seeing her every week for a year, and she got me to a pretty far. And so I've known Sandy for all these years, and she brought a whole bunch of people and very savvy players along. Well, I remember she met you early, and so I called Sandy to check in with her, and I said, Sandy, what do you remember about Warwick? And then you and I during the prep calls, you remember her. And the one thing she said was, Andrew, he was a reiner and he wasn't practicing relationship-based, natural horsemanship. And I don't really know. She told me, she goes, I don't really know how he got to where he is right now because it's really different. And so one of the things I want to talk about is where you were at that time, because tonight, going from whatever Sandy was describing, and she may or may not have seen you the way that you saw yourself, but to today, that's huge. And she wanted to pass along her best wishes. She's teaching a class right now, but Sandy's still connected. She's into what we're doing with the IHF. And I just wanted to think about that reference because her perception of you was that you weren't natural at that time.
Well, what's interesting, I think that, there's a saying something about, the path is not a straight line, the path is a spiral, and you keep spiraling back and seeing deeper truths in things you thought you already knew. And what was really interesting when Sandy and another friend of hers, and I can't remember her name.
Yeah, they were natural horse partners. I remember that.
Yeah, and they started coming and taking lessons. I wanted to learn how to do the reining with their horses. And I didn't know much about the whole, how the whole Pirelli thing worked at the time. But what I learned was I didn't teach them anything that they didn't already know. They'd say, okay, to start to teach your horse to spin, first you do this, and then you do this, and then when this happens, you do this. And Sandy would always go, oh, Pat calls that the, pat your head and rub your tummy exercise or whatever. And it didn't matter what I told them, they already knew how to do it, but they probably knew that that particular exercise in a fundamental way, and probably didn't realize you could use it in a technical way as well. But I don't think I don't know how long I was helping them because they'd come every week. I don't think I ever told them something. They went, oh, I didn't know that. It was everything I said to do, and it only had to do with the reining. They're like, oh yes, Pat calls that the whatever exercise. And so it's really interesting that I wasn't doing, well, first of all, I was going to say I wasn't doing natural horsemanship. First of all, I'm not much of a fan of the term natural horsemanship I think the natural part of it, the nature part of it, is understanding the nature of horses. For me, that's the nature part of it. I don't really think there's anything natural about riding around the back of a horse. But if you think about it, I didn't have them do something they already didn't learn in their natural horsemanship stuff. So it was exactly the same stuff. It might have been, had to do with more precision or whatever, but they weren't foreign concepts to Sandy. And I'm sorry, I can't remember.
It's Rachel. And by the way, it was
Rachel, that's her
Rachel.
name. Yes.
I think it's Rushlow or something. Yeah, Rachel.
I don't know, and
yeah.
So I remember I was in Australia a few years later, and we moved back to Australia for a few years, and I did a demonstration somewhere. It was a reining demonstration, and the local Pirelli instructor had seen it and told one of her students, "Hey, you should go see this guy." And so she she called me up and wanted to come and take a lesson. And she said, "Oh, I've got to tell you, I do Pirelli." I'm like, "Oh, well, that's awesome." I said, that'll be great. I said, and I said, "What level are you?" And she told me what level she was. I think she was level 3. She wasn't level 3 instructor, but she was level 3. And I said, "Well, that's great." I said, "Because I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know." And she's like, "No, your horse does this and this and this, so I'm sure you could show me lots of things." And it was kind of the same thing with her. It was just more precise versions of the same things. So it was kind of cool. But yeah, it was fun helping Sandy and Rachel back then, because it wasn't like I had to explain things to them in a certain way. Like they already understood those concepts in a different way. So, but as far as the progression from the reining, if you think about it, people say the reining, they say, "How do you make the horses do those things?" And you can't make a horse do those things. You have to teach them to want to. It has to be a choice. And most of the reining training, the way you teach the horses to do the maneuvers is set it up so they decide to do the maneuvers. You're not actually forcing them in there. So I think the reining was a really good background for me. And like I said, as the years go on, you see deeper and deeper truths in things. And I'd been, for many years, I'd been probably since I moved back from Australia. So in 2010, I'd been taking on, like bucking and bolting and rearing warm bloods and those sorts of things, and solving the problems by digging deep and understanding where the problem was coming from. You know what I mean? I'd always been drawn to that, sort of thing. And what was funny was one time I had an eventing trainer and her daughter from the area had this horse that used to buck them off or something. And they sent it to me, and I found out later they sent it to me because I wore a cowboy hat and I was going to ride the buck out of it, which nothing could be further from the truth. But what I find these days is looking back at things I used to do is like, okay, yeah, it can be more subtle or whatever, but I actually do see deeper truths in them.
No, it's very interesting because the way, as I'm listening to you talk about it, we in Pirelli talked about bringing principles to purpose, and they had the principles and you had the purpose, and you guys were connecting in the middle. And so as they got, and obviously you had principles that got to you where you were, maybe you didn't have a language or a step-by-step thing that's adults like me who had never had a horse before could follow. But clearly what I'm hearing was they were looking for how they could take their principles of purpose, and you connected very well. And she does have really positive memories of that. But let me jump a little ahead, and I know there's going to be an in-between here, because in one of your podcasts, you talked about a big transitional period of your life around 2018, or something like that. We'll get there. But I want to go back to 2019 at Horse Expo, Western States Horse Expo. And of course, we are looking forward to being there with you and David Litchman. But David Litchman and I have been friends for, the whole time I've had my horse of 23 years now. And he was kind enough to introduce me to you. We were in the paddocks, and at the time you were a headliner in the clinicians, and you were already leading influencer. You were already a leading influencer in this relationship-based horsemanship world. That was a huge transition. Well, at least from the perspective of those who have observed you, maybe not for you, but there's a huge transition between this Sandy time and then this David Lichman introduced me to you. And I understand that trauma therapists had a big role in the guidance in between that time that helped influence your life and your career path. And is that correct?
Yeah, I think probably the trauma stuff came a little bit later. So probably the big crux of the whole thing was in about 2015. My wife bought a reining horse named Sherlock, and he was a very high level reining horse, like superior athlete, could do all the hard things so easily, but he had a slight issue, so we bought him because the trainer that had him sitting, like, he spooks at the judges' chairs and does different, some little quirky things like that. And I'm like, well, I can solve those problems. That's not a big deal. And those problems weren't that hard to solve, but he had some underlying tension, and I couldn't solve the problem. I couldn't train that tension out of him. And it's the simplest little thing. What he would do, so in a reining pattern, you start with a 70, and if you can earn 4 points in the whole pattern, you can be a 74. That's a big score. But they have penalties, and anytime a horse is not in the correct lead, it's a 1-point penalty, even if it's just for one stride. Well, what Sherlock would do, he wouldn't be on the wrong lead, but when in his fast circles, he'd be running around, and because he'd get tense going fast, he would bounce his hind feet together one stride like that. That is not on the correct lead. That's not a split stride. It is not on the correct lead. It's not the wrong lead, but it's not on the correct lead. So he would incur a point penalty every time he did that. Well, he might do it 4 times in his circles. He might do it 2 times in his left circles and 2 times in his right circles. So he does all the hard stuff enough to score a 74, but he only comes out with a 70 because he does these foot bouncy thing. And, there was just an underlying level of tension, and I tried training that out of him, and I couldn't train that out of him because I thought that was a good idea at the time, to try to train tension out of a horse. And so my wife was showing him, and so I just kind of stepped away from trying to make him any different. She could still compete and do quite well, she could still be second and third every time she showed him. She should have been winning it with the hard stuff he can do. But what he made me do was start looking outside the places I'd been looking for answers before. Like, I'd always been trying to learn more, but it was learning more about training techniques. And what he made me start looking at was, I started reading articles by people that I wouldn't have read articles by before, people that I would have placed in the crazy cat lady category of the horse world. Okay. Like, these people can't get their horse to do anything, but they love their horses and they talk to them and they feed, and so I started, I'm like, okay, so what I know can't help, isn't helping him. I'm wondering what else there is. And so I started looking at things quite a bit. Well, I'm looking at things outside, where I would normally look. And I had a thing happen probably in 2017. I did a clinic in Texas, and there was a Mustang at this clinic who is 9 years old, been out of the wild for 6 years, and has a random bolting problem. And they can't figure out we couldn't figure out why he bolts. Like, the trainer doesn't know why he bolts. It's random. There's nothing common, there's no common denominator. And so it was a 3-day clinic. I don't remember this horse the first day, but the second day, the lady was just on the ground, and she was just going to walk down beside him and ask him to disengage, just to step over behind. And apparently, I didn't see it, but she said, "Hey, can you help me here a second?" I go to walk down his side, and he turns his head to block me. What should I do? And I said, "Oh, let me take a hold of him, and I'll have a look at it." So I stood in front of this horse, and I went to walk down his near side. And as I did, he went to turn his head to block me. Now, in the past, all I would have done is just reached under his jaw just moved his jaw over. So now he's looking at me out of his left eye instead of his right eye, and I would have continued down that side. So there's no correction. It's not, there's no repercussion for it. But what I did this time, because of these things I've been reading and looking at things differently, I went to walk in that side and he turned his head and blocked me. So instead of moving his head, I just stepped back to where I was. And I said, okay, I see that for some reason that concerns you. I'm not sure why, but I'm going to honor the fact you're telling me it concerns you. And then I waited for him to relax a little bit. And maybe he started blinking again. Maybe his ears started moving again. It wasn't as big as like a lick or a chew or whatever. So then I tried it again. He turned his head. I stepped back. And this went on for 5 or 10 minutes. And then I walked down that side. Then after 5 or 10 minutes, he lets me walk down that side of him. And I said, well, probably why he was blocking us out is because you've probably overdone this disengaging thing. You've probably done it a million times. He's like, I don't want you to walk down there and they're going to disengage me. And so I disengage, which he did perfectly well because he was very well trained. And then I said, now watch this. I'm going to walk back to the front and he's probably going to block me out when I walk down the side. So I walk back to the front. I walk down the side. He lets me. So I disengage him. I go back to the front. I'm going to try it again. I disengage him. And I said, I'm going to keep going. And he's, after 2 or 3 times, he's probably going to say, no, I'm sick of this disengaging thing. I did it 10 or 15 times and he did it perfectly every time. And he let me walk down the side of him. And I said, well, I cannot figure out why this horse was saying no before, because it's not the disengaging that bothers him. I just overdid it just to prove a point. And the point didn't get proven. Like he didn't say, no, I don't want you to do that. I said, I'm not really sure. But anyway, he lets us disengage him now. Here you go. So I handed the lead rope back to her and went to help somebody else. And about 10 minutes later, she said, what do you want me to do with him? And I said, just stand there with him, just hang, Let him process that. And about 10 minutes later, I hear this collective gasp from everybody there. And I turn and look, and this horse has buckled at the knees, fallen to his belly, and he's on his belly with his knees buckled under him, with his head straight up and down, snoring little dust clouds in the dirt. And then he has a roll, jumps up, shakes, and then boom, goes down and falls asleep again. And I said to her, is that normal? And she said, I've had him for 6 years and seen him lay down once. And I'm like, well, that is not normal. And he slept, at the time I was having like a morning group and an afternoon group. He was in a morning group and he slept for probably an hour and a half till lunchtime. We had to wake him up to get the second group in. So the next day when she came back in, she said, what do you want me to do with him? I said, just hang with him and see what he does. And after about 20 minutes, boom, down he went and slept for 4 hours. So this horse doesn't lay down. She's had him for 6 years and seen him lay down once. And something happened to cause him to lay down and have a huge, big sleep. And I knew something had happened at the time. I didn't know what it was. I came home from there and started looking around the internet about sleeping, horses and sleeping. And, I knew they could sleep standing up with that lock stay apparatus. I knew they'd sleep laying down. But what I didn't realize is horses, like humans, need a certain amount of REM sleep a day. And if they don't, if humans don't get it, you're either anxious or irritable. And horses need to lay down flat in order to get that REM sleep. And the moral to the story is, I didn't know this at the time, but that was 5 years ago. He has never bolted since.
Nice.
And the only thing I did with that horse was when he said, I don't want you to go down there. I said, okay, I'll listen to that. So the only thing I did was listen. And that really got me. Then I started, I was doing lots of clinics. So I would have 12 different horses every weekend and I'd start practicing stuff. I'd show up at these clinics and I'd say, so I got to tell you something. The guy that you've seen on YouTube and watch the videos or whatever, and you come to see him in the clinic? I'm not that guy. I don't really know what guy I am, but I'm not that guy. I'm going to try some stuff with these horses. If you guys will bear with me, I'm going to, I may have some answers, I may not, but I'm going to do a lot of experimenting. So I started experimenting a lot with horses and at clinics and seeing how much I could do by just letting them know I noticed things. And the results were amazing. So it's not, just last year, actually, I changed my business name to Warwick Schiller, Attuned Horsemanship.
Mm-hmm.
And attunement is a term I first read in a book by a UCLA professor of psychology named Daniel Siegel. And he said, attunement's the sense of being seen and being heard. And I had a trauma therapist from Canada on the podcast named Sarah Schlocky. And Sarah said, she expands upon that. She says, attunement is the sense of being seen, being heard, feeling felt, and getting gotten. And looking back, that's what I did with that Mustang. Was I said, I see you. I see your concern. Now, it wasn't a lot of concern. It wasn't like he was terrified with his head in the air and his eyes bulging, running backwards. He just turned his head and he said, I don't really want you to do that. And I don't think he didn't want me to do that. I think he was actually checking to see what I would do when he did that. And I imagine a lot of people watching this are ladies, you know, when you do what I do, 90% of you, the people you deal with are women. And I say to them, ever play hard to get back in your younger dating days? Ever play hard to get? And they go, yeah. And I say, but you didn't play hard to get because you didn't want to get got. You didn't want to not get caught. I said, what are you doing when you're playing hard to get? You are checking to see if they are actually interested in you or the nearest warm body. Okay. If you play hard to get and they keep pursuing you, then they have a direct interest in you. And what I think you are doing when you do that, one of the things you're doing is testing your level of safety, or maybe not necessarily safety there, but I think horses do they ask a lot of questions of us to check. Basically, these days, I've got to the point where they're checking our level of awareness. They're checking how present we are because, you know, if you think about the safety a horse feels in a herd, it does not come from the physicality of the herd. It's not like several members of the herd go to Brazilian jiu-jitsu once a week, and if the saber-toothed tiger shows up and get him in a headlock, that's not what they feel. That's not why they feel safe in a herd. They feel safe in a herd because of the shared awareness, what I call the awareness burden. And you know, you see someone leading a horse and they're walking along and the horse is like sticking its head and looking around and whinnying and carrying on. A horse like that is saying, in my experience around humans, they are not very present. So I need to look 360 degrees to keep an eye out for danger because you guys are in your head and on your phone and all that sort of stuff. You know, there's an old, I think it was a Ray Hunt saying that said, they know when you know and they know when you don't. And I used to think that saying meant they know when you're a gunsel and they know when you're not. They know when you know what you're talking about with horses. They know if you know horses and they know if you don't. And then a number of years ago, I was reading an article by someone who was around Ray a lot. And he said, you know, when you're around your horse, you need to know what his ears are doing, what his eyes are doing, what his nostrils are doing, what his muscles are doing, what his breathing's doing, what his back's doing, what his tail's doing. Is it clamped? Is it tight? Is it loose? Is it up in the air? What's his back? What's his breathing doing? What's his feet doing? Are they square? Are they offset? And you need to know all that because they know when you know and they know when you don't. They basically know when you are present. And so that whole attunement thing is about communicating your awareness. And I think sometimes it ends up you're communicating your awareness of their awareness of your awareness of their awareness. But it's amazing when you can get to where every interaction you have with them, you are communicating your awareness of stuff. It really like soothes the nervous system. So, you know, basically most people having a problem with a horse is dealing with a horse who at that point in time has a dysregulated nervous system for some reason. They're over threshold for some reason. And you know, I think once you asked me about trauma therapists. So once you really start understanding how the nervous system is supposed to work, I think it really changes how you look at things with horses. You know, you talked about me presenting at the Western States Horse Expo. I'm doing it again here in a couple of weeks. And one of the things they have us do is called a clinicians unmounted. So you do a talk. And so they always want your title 6 months ahead of time. So I have a few saved up that I just email them ahead of time. And probably sometime that year, sometime after that Mustang, I did one at Madison, Wisconsin at the Midwest Horse Fair. And it was one of those talks. And one of the titles I have that I use all the time is Everything I Learned in Life I Learned from Horses. And in that one, I started talking about probably the Mustang, but I started talking about looking at things a bit differently. And during that talk, there was probably 150, 200 people in the room. During that talk, I probably told that crowd of strangers stuff I'd probably never told many people in my life. Possibly, there's quite a possibility there were some things I said that I'd probably never even admitted to myself. And so when I left there, I was walking back to my booth and I walked past Barbara Schulte's booth, and Barb said, "So how'd your talk go?" And I said, "Oh, Barb, I'm exhausted. I feel like I've been run over by a truck." And she said, "Why is that?" And I told her, and she goes, "Oh, well, Brene Brown says vulnerability is the ultimate badassery," or something like that, you know. And I said, "Who?" And she said, "Brene Brown." She told me about Brene Brown. So I came home from that horse expo and I looked up Brene Brown and got some of her audio books. And one day I'm listening to one of her audio books and she says, "You cannot selectively suppress emotions. If you suppress the lower emotions, you also suppress the higher emotions." And I'm thinking, well, you know, growing up in rural Australia, you know, as a male, boys aren't supposed to show fear and you're not supposed to show this. And in my family, we didn't show grief. Like, you know, I remember, you know, go to a funeral, I'm like, "Oh, well, he's dead. No use worrying about that." And then I realized I knew that the lower emotions were suppressed, but I didn't realize, could I experience more joy or more happiness or whatever in my life? So I started, you know, going to some therapy about that. And what it really came down to, what I came to realize is that I was very shut down, which is really interesting because this whole line of inquiry came from a horse, Sherlock, who was very shut down. And so that was a rabbit hole I started down then. And then, you know, that Mustang at the clinic was a kind of a game changer, because you have something like that happen. And even though I didn't know that he's not going to bolt in the next 5 years from that one little interaction I had with him, I did know that there was a huge change in that horse from something I did. And I would say that's the first time I'd ever had a change in a horse. I helped facilitate a change in a horse, but I didn't teach him anything. I didn't train him. I listened. I didn't tell him to do anything. I mean, when I disengaged him, I was just checking to see what result would happen from that. But the change in that horse did not come from me telling him what to do. The change in that horse came from me listening to what he had to say.
That's really deep. Just to let everybody know, we're going to talk about his podcasts in a minute, because the podcasts are a big part of what Warwick's doing right now. Ada, who's on the call, who's been following Warwick, told me, "Andrew, go back and listen to the first podcast. The first podcast, I believe, is called Changes."
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I believe this was at the beginning of the pandemic, and you had talked about, hey, you know, I can't really go out there and do anything. I got to do something. So I'll do podcasts. And I keep smiling listening to you as you were going through your story, because I kind of knew where you were going. Anybody on the call who wants to hear that story in even a little more detail, it's in that Changes. And you talked about Sherlock, and you talked about the lady's horse, and a lot of your progression. And I called Ada right away and said, "Oh my God, you just gave me fire. That's exactly what I needed before I had my connecting call with you to prepare for this." And so I really want to talk about for the minute, because let's go to it. You made the pivot to do these podcasts, and your podcast is called Journey On Podcast. And in it, you share your story of transformational growth. The first podcast called Changes, and then I went and counted up. I think you're about at 120, if I got it right.
Yeah, I think it's around there.
Yeah, right around 120 over the 3 years. Your download count, you celebrated exceeding 1 million.
No, we're about 2.5 million now.
2.5 million. Yeah, I saw the celebration where you made it. So wonderful. You're at 2.5 times. That's wonderful.
I think we passed 2 million around about Christmas time. I think we did around about last Christmas. I think we passed a couple.
Oh, wonderful. That's awesome. So, I mean, obviously, I think you're supporting this notion I brought up at the beginning, is that your influence is increasing. But here's the thing. I went through your list and I saw all these names. Some of them I very much connected with, where we know Karen Rolfe very well. We know Dr. Jennifer Zelig. We had her on the IHF Live with David Lichman. And I went through there, and Jonathan Field, good friend of
Jonathan Field.
mine. And he was getting his third star when I was taking my level 3 with Linda back in 2002. So I knew him when he was very much in the Pirelli system. And it wasn't because of Pat and Linda, it was because some other issue that he left. And then he went off to become one of the biggest names in Canada. He's done a TED Talk. So you've interviewed Jonathan, so all of a sudden familiar names, but then there's a bunch of other names that aren't familiar. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you, and this is just even my own interest, especially my interest now in helping connect a lot more, many more people who are doing this. You've interviewed a lot of them. Can you tell us about some of your kind of the calls that you really remember of during this journey of podcasting?
Yeah. So the podcast, it's funny how things start out. We can't remember who decided to do the podcast. My wife or I thought it'd be a good idea to do a podcast, but my wife's idea was, she said, you know what you should do? She used to listen to this call-in psychologist or whatever she was, called the Dr. Laura Show. People would call in with their problems. You know, it's kind of like a call-in. What's the guy on the TV? You know, he's from the South. He's got a mustache.
Larry King?
No. People, he's a psychologist. People come on there and they've got all sorts of problems.
Oh, I know Dr. Phil.
Dr. Phil, there you go.
Yeah.
So kind of like a horse call-in show, Dr. Phil type thing. And I was like, yeah, I'm not really sure. But the thing about, if I was going to do something like that, every time I talk to someone, I'd have to try to explain to them how to look at things differently, because your problem is not really your problem. And so the first episode was changes. It's like, okay, this is the way I look at things now. And the second episode was called The Science of Connection. And it was about polyvagal theory and how connection works. And then I don't think I'd still decided I wasn't going to do the call-in thing, but then I had a friend of ours in New Zealand, Jane Pike, on, and Jane, back then she called herself an equestrian mindset coach. I'm not really sure. She was our mental coach for the World Equestrian Games in 2018. But Jane has, you know, she's been all over the world. She lived in an ashram in India. She used to do aid work. You know, she's telling stories about being in the tsunami in Bangladesh, and she'd sleep at nighttime with her passport duct taped to her chest in case she got washed away in the middle of the night. All those sorts of things. So that was, you know, she was my first guest, and then I had another guest that I knew through horses, and another guest I knew through horses, but we didn't talk about horses at all. It was about, it's called the Journey on Podcast. And it's about the journey that got you to the point where you are now. And there might be some horses along the way, but we've never talked about horse nutrition or horse training or, you know, any specifics about horses. And it's funny how the Journey on Podcast got its name. There's a musician from South Africa who follows me, and he wrote this song called Journey On, and he'd send it to me in acoustic version. I'm like, I love that thing. That's cool. He says, oh, we'll do a full studio version. So we did a full studio version of it. And then he sent it to me and I'm like, yeah, that's great. So then when we're deciding to do a podcast, I'm like, we need to get some music for the podcast. You know, we need to get some sort of a song. I'm like, hang on, we could use that South African guy's song and we could call the podcast the Journey On Podcast, because it's about journeys. And like the song starts out, journey on, the magic lies within the trails we ride. Journey on, the lightness you seek there is by your side. When everything that's shut down is coming back to life, just because he knows that you know. So it's about that attunement whole thing, the first 4 lines of that whole song. But that's how we got the Journey On Podcast. And then, you know, I just have had lots of people on there, and, you know, I ask questions about their journey. We've never actually talked one single thing about how to train a horse or horses. It's more about the journeys. And I've had, you know, they're not all horse people I've had on there. But everybody's, you know, the thing that I've had a lot of feedback from people is that there's probably two big things that people get out of the podcast guests. And one is me too. Oh, I thought I was the only person who'd ever felt that way. Because people are pretty vulnerable and share stuff. And then the other thing that people get out of it is there's more to life than what we're living. So those are probably the two. And there's a lot of mental health stuff in there. You know, I've had trauma therapists on there. I've actually had people in the mental health field who have horses. That's how they got listening to my podcast. Actually have other mental health professionals listen to the podcast, even though they don't have horses, because, you know, it's not really anything to do with horses.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You mentioned South Africa, and I made a promise to somebody who on the International Horsemanship Foundation Facebook page, we had put up an advert for this event, and I got a message here from somebody called Be Natural. It says, "Hi Warwick, greetings from South Africa. I've been trying to find space somewhere on Facebook to thank you for your amazing guidance in horsemanship. My rescue Basudo pony is a very troubled pony with a sad background. Trying my best to apply your principles has made a huge difference. Thank you so much. Kind regards, Petra." And maybe I'm putting you on the spot as to who this person in the whole world, but somebody in South Africa responded, and I just thought that you should hear that. And I made a promise to him. I said, great to hear it from you. We will pass along the thank you note to Warwick.
Well, thanks, Petra. That's awesome. I actually had I had a South African horseman on the podcast one time, and it was funny. He was a bit late getting on. I said, "Oh, you okay?" And he goes, "Oh, yes, the caretaker's wife had a king cobra on her doorstep, and I just had to go and get rid of it." And I'm like, "What did you do with it?" And he goes, "Oh, it's in a plastic container right here." And he turns the camera, and he's got a big Tupperware with a cobra in it with the lid on it. He says, I didn't have time to take him away and turn him loose before we started the podcast, so he's just going to sit there. I'm talking to this guy with a king cobra in a plastic thing, and then while I'm talking to him, was it Impala? I think an Impala walked in the door and had to lay down in the corner. It was nutty. It was pretty crazy.
Interesting. Well, so have you been? Do you go down to South Africa?
I've been to South Africa once. Been there once. Went to Africa. On one trip, we went to Kenya. I did a clinic there, and then I went to South Africa and did a couple of clinics in Johannesburg. And then a separate trip, I went to Morocco. And Morocco is actually in Africa, but, you know, Morocco is where they say it's where Europe meets Africa meets the Middle East. So, and that, you know, that was an interesting thing. One of the podcasts I did was on manifesting. It was called How to Manifest a Car Crash. And I talked, I've been able to manifest for years without even knowing I could do it. I thought I was lucky, you know. And a couple of years ago, I'm like, you know, I've been to some pretty cool places to do clinics. And what I'd like to do is I want someone to contact me from somewhere exotic that I've never been before. And anyway, I put that out there to the universe. And about 2 months later, I get an email from the wife of the British ambassador to Morocco. It says, would you like to come to Morocco and work with some horses for the prince or something or other? I'm like, yeah, I think that counts. Yes. And so we actually went to Morocco and got to stay in the British ambassador's residence for a week. Wow. So we had the, you know, the Range Rover with the diplomatic plates with the ex-special forces guy to drive us around and take us anywhere we want to go. And we went to the races at Casablanca and just,
oh my gosh,
pretty amazing.
That was wonderful. You were a VIP then.
Yeah, it was very cool. One of those experiences you can't buy. You can't go online and say, hey, I want to pay money to spend a week in the British ambassador's residence in Morocco and get taken around and have the personal chef cook me breakfast and all those sorts of things. You can't buy that.
And I do want to talk about manifesting in just a second, but one of the things my team is reminding me is that I haven't promoted the fundraiser. And I just put it up on the chat. It says, if you're enjoying tonight's show, please consider supporting our nonprofit so we can continue running programs like this. And we have one called IHF Live with Warwick Schiller as our fundraiser. If you get on there and you click on that, it should be pretty easy. We really appreciate it because we are a nonprofit. Our mission, which I love telling everybody and remind everybody, our mission, it's to enrich the lives of humans and horses through relationship-based horsemanship, education, communication, and community. If you can help us out with a little bit of maybe coffee money or something that you're willing to give, we really appreciate it. I want to switch back to the manifesting because this is something that I've actually had some training in the last couple of years, and it's one of the things that's really kind of, I was raised religious in Episcopal church, and you kind of go, okay, you have faith that there's a higher power, but when you manifest something and stuff starts to happen, I mean, you go, whoa, wait a second. I mean, is that all from me? I don't think so. I think there's something bigger out there that connects us. Long story short, I had a counselor once. I was going to a marriage counselor just because I had a bad breakup. I wasn't married, but I had a bad breakup. I wanted to talk. And she says, well, I want you to write down what you're really looking for, almost like you're shopping for a car. I want you to write down all the things that you really want in a life partner. And then I want you to write down what you don't want. Just like shopping. And I came back the next day and I had 2 pages, both sides. And she goes, oh my gosh, Andrew, I've never seen anybody go longer than 5 or 6 things. This is incredible. And so I went, okay, well, and I put it away. I put it in my files, right? And about my wife, Renee, and we have 4 grandkids, 4 horses. We have a wonderful life here in California. And when we were together, one time I'm going through my papers and I pulled out the sheet and I turned the page and I'm like, oh my gosh, I manifested Renee. I manifested the woman that I'm married to. And so that was a little bit before I'd learned about this more intentional and the fact that you could actually connect to your subconscious and you could, there's these processes now, these processes that we can actually use to manifest and be intentional. And I know Robin's into them. I know you're into them. I'm studying them in a way. When we listen to what Jennifer Zelig's doing with the Zen Buddhism, you go, there is a higher power. You don't have to. I got my proof. One of the things that we've talked about is this work where you're doing where people are learning about being a better self with the horse, and they're doing it with a horse because they want to do it for the horse and their relationship with the horse, and then they end up doing something for themselves. And it improves their life with everybody, the other people. Oh my God, that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this, is because it's my wife's life, my life, my horse's life, it's my career. Everything's been better off since I got into this movement. Specifically, you've been talking about that the horse just happens to be the medium, or it happens to be the subject. And then these people are discovering things because they wouldn't normally in their life stop their life or just focus on this, but they'll do it for their horse. Can you talk about that? Because this is all just so wonderful stuff. I'm really into it. I've been studying it for a couple of years now. I know Robin's studying it. And so let's go to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you basically summed it up there, but over the years, I've had people tell me, since I started doing this stuff with the horses, doing this stuff a certain way, basically it was following my stuff, but you could be following a lot of people's stuff. But like, since I've been doing your stuff with the horses, I'm getting along so much better with my husband and my kids and my coworkers and my boss or whatever. And I've heard it a million times. And the thing about horses, I think, is people are passionate about their horses. They have a huge amount of passion for it and they want to get along with their horse, and they will do the work for the horse, but they've been married to the same guy for 30 years and haven't done the work for him, but they get the benefit from it. And I don't think it's just family. You know, I had a guy contact me a number of years ago whose wife was into horses, and she'd watch my videos, and he'd kind of watch over his shoulder, but he wasn't the guy that's into the horses. And he worked for, I think it was like maybe Ingersoll Rand, the company that makes elevators and forklifts and stuff. And he was like one of 5 worldwide managers. And one of the things they are rated on at work is their employee satisfaction and their direct reports satisfaction. And he had never been number 5, so he'd never been the worst one, but he'd been number 4 out of the 5 worldwide managers ever since he'd had the job. And he said about 12 months after he started watching the videos and thinking about things differently, with having different responses to what the horses do rather than your same old programmed responses, he got to number 2. And like, you know, it's nothing to do with horses. I recently had an email from a guy who was a former NHL hockey player, played in the NHL for 15 years and was one of the big enforcer guys. Like, I looked him up on YouTube. There's so many fights of this guy on YouTube. Big dude. But anyway, I guess when he was playing, he was heavily into drugs and alcohol. Anyway, got dried out. But anyway, now what he does is he coaches kids. But I guess his wife's got a horse, or maybe he's got a horse. But anyway, he emailed me recently and said, you know what? I'm being a better dad, a better husband, and a better hockey coach.
Wonderful.
And this horse stuff. Now think about this. This guy played in the NHL for 15 years. He knows hockey. So what's a horse going to teach him about being a hockey coach? It's more how to relate to others. And, you know, I presented horse expos around the world, and I used to do a horse expo in New Zealand every year. And it's a 4-day horse expo. They have one big main Coliseum type arena, but they have these outside arenas, and outside each arena is like a sound tech booth, and you got to go over there and the guy mics you up or whatever, you know, and they're kind of usually roadie type sound tech type guys, you know. And there's this one guy there, I see him every year, and I go over there. This is kind of when I started talking about things differently instead of just straight horse training. And he'd mic me up every day, and I got an email, a Facebook message from him on Sunday night. Let's see if I can get through this. I got a Facebook message from him on the Sunday night saying that before the horse expo, he was considering taking his own life. And listening to the presentations that I did over the weekend changed his mind.
Wow. That's phenomenal. What an honor.
Yeah. And I wasn't talking about, I was talking about, well, I think that was when I really started talking about, I tell you what horse expo that probably was. When I started looking at things differently, I started seeing a therapist and things like that. So at a horse expo, someone would bring me a troubled horse or whatever, and they'd hand it to me, and I would do some things with the horse, and the horse would be different. But this was in New Zealand. There's actually a video of this on my YouTube channel. And this lady leads this dressage horse in, and it's walking around and it's spooking at everything and running into her and pushing into her and pulling away from her and rearing up and doing stuff. And I let her walk around for about 15 minutes while they kind of introed what I was about to do. And I said, okay, bring the horse over here. And she handed the horse to me. And as I took the lead rope, that whole horse kind of softened, put his nose out, and kind of came over and sniffed my midsection, and was a completely different horse. And I hadn't done anything. And so I said to the crowd, did you guys see that? I said, I didn't do anything right then. And by that, I mean, there's not some sort of energy I projected towards the horse, or some sort of secret handshake, or some horse training, something that I need to know. I said, I just took the lead rope, and I said, I don't know what just happened, but I have an idea what just happened. And it's not anything to do with horses. It has to do with my perception of the world, how I view the world, how I view me, how I view being in front of all you people. And do I really care if you think anything of me or not? And I said, there's there's so much that goes into all that. And yeah, this horse was a completely different horse when she handed me the lead rope. And that was probably the first time it had happened. That was probably after my first year of therapy. But yeah, so then it was about then I started talking about different things. You know, the thing with people with their horses, the energy you bring to the situation, your perception of the situation, perception of what the horse is doing, all that comes from stuff outside horses. And you know, I had Mark, you wouldn't know of Mark Rashid. I had Mark Rashid on the podcast, and he was talking.
We know Mark, he's relationship-based. Yes, thank you.
He was talking about a documentary film that him and Jim Masterson made called A Mind Like Still Water. And he explained a mind like still water. He said, you know, if you go out in the morning to a pond before there's a breeze, if you look into that pond, you will see a direct reflection of what's on the other side of that pond. But if you take a pebble and throw it into that pond, you have now changed what that reflection looks like. And you don't get a direct reflection of the other side of that pond. And I think that's what happens with a lot of times with people and their horses. They muddy the waters quite a bit, which means whatever the horse is actually showing you is not what they see, because we have these lenses from all our experiences in life, our childhood experiences and horse experiences or whatever. And we jump to conclusions about what's really going on. And so when we draw the wrong conclusion, then we come up with the wrong response. And then a lot of times that gives you a poorer conclusion, and then you come up with another response. And yeah, it's really amazing what horses are like when you can show up and be able to see the horse for who they are, not project all your stuff on there, you know.
Well, I want to talk about that because we had, not just a couple months ago, we do this show about once a month, and then a couple times back we had David Lichman and Jennifer Zelig. And one of the things that Jennifer has got that book, and you were very lavish with your praise, and you said everybody should read Mindfulness. So we know a lot about the mindfulness book, and I studied with them. And one of the things that I learned, and then I want to connect this also with Dr. Sean Hollenbeck, who's our board member, who's really passionate about equine assisted therapy, and he works with veterans. And he has this concept of when you get to the gate, leave it at the gate. And leave it at the gate means take all of your BS, all the crap in your life, everything that's in your mind, and you have this physical thought of, I'm taking it all off my shoulders and I'm leaving at the gate. And then I open up the gate. And by the way, I do this every day now. When I pull up to the gate, I get out of my truck and I go over and I open up the gate, and I'm literally having this Dr. Hollenbeck and Jennifer Zelig moment, connecting them both from what I've learned from them. And I leave it at the gate. And then as I pull the gate shut, my mind is on the moment. And I'm looking for my horse, Sonny. I can call him if I want. He's on kind of 8 acres off a 20-acre ranch. And I start to look at him. And this is the part from Jennifer, which is are you listening? Are you listening to the horse? And she talks about specific processes. And you talk about specific processes. And some of the other learning that we're talking about, like this being seen, being heard, feeling felt, and getting gotten. We're talking about specific processes. And I am noticing that my horse, who's now Sonny's in our 18th year together, and we've been doing this maybe the last 2 years, because that's when David turned me on to the class and I went for Jennifer. Our relationship has just took off. It's exponential, and my horse just is so much more relaxed around me. We get so much more done. Oh, and the other one that David's kind of turned us on to is a lot of liberty, because he's a huge liberty guy. I often don't pick up my halter for weeks. I'm doing everything at liberty with him now. And part of this is, how am I showing up and how am I being in the moment and all these kind of things. So one thing I want to say, though, is not only that, Jennifer and David, but several of our guests And it seemed like there's a trend here. Several of our guests have been bringing different ways of describing it. Some come from yoga, some come from some other ways. About this, how do you show up for the horse? How are you in the moment? How are you listening to the horse? And I think that's going to be, this show is about the revolution in horsemanship. Dr. Miller wrote about it in a 2004, 2005, and I'm very inspired by that book. He talked about 70 clinicians at the time. There's many more. If he were writing it today, he'd write about you. But here's the thing, I told him I'm going to bring this theme to this show. And this is definitely a big deal in the revolution right now. And it's one of the reasons why I think people are really connecting to you. You say you connected to Brene Brown. When I heard her for the first time, I went, oh my gosh, she's amazing. And she's very connecting. And if we look at who the demographic is, and we hope we get more men in this, but the women, they're going to eat this stuff up. In fact, if they must 2.5 million downloads of the podcast. But I think there's something really going on here that the shift in the revolution is now about how are we showing up in the moment and how are we listening to the horse. What are your comments on that?
Yeah, I think, what's funny is I've had different people on the podcast like Carolyn Resnick. Okay. Carolyn's been doing this stuff for years. Have you ever heard of Dr. Susan Fay?
Yeah, I think so. Not very.
So she wrote a book called Sacred Spaces, but she's been doing this stuff for years, and she actually got to where she was almost going to quit because no one was listening to her. They've been, so it's not that this stuff hasn't been around. I just think with, social media these days and YouTube and all that sort of thing, I think it's much easier to spread a message, and it's much harder to be ignorant these days. It's much harder to be uneducated about things because information's so easy to come by. But I do think the revolution is not. I don't think it's a revolution in horsemanship at all. I think it is a raising the level of consciousness of humans as a whole, and the horse part of it's playing its part. But I think it's going on everywhere else too. But as far as the horses go, what makes the horsemanship better is when the human does raise their consciousness a bit more, and you start to be a lot more self-aware, and do some inner work, do some work on yourself, and just doing that. And like I said before, about perceptions and changing your energy and changing your intentions. And sometimes doing that stuff is what solves the issue they were having with their horse anyway.
Exactly.
But I do think there is a bit of a revolution, but I think it's more of a consciousness revolution.
No, I really appreciate that. And one of the things that you talked about was that you began having these summits, and your summits, I think you said in San Antonio, Texas, you'd had 23 presenters, 250 people. And you said, Andrew's really, it's not about the horse. The horse is maybe the vehicle or the vessel, but it's the extent to which human consciousness in the context of the horse.
Yes, that was one of our podcast guests and our good friend Kerry Lake. She wrote that before the summit. She said this is going to be a gathering of people that talking about raising human consciousness in the context of life among horses or something like that. So we had 22 of the first year's guests that come and present there. Karen Rolfe was one of them.
Karen Rolfe, yeah.
Karen was there. She's amazing. Elsa Sinclair was there. Do you know Elsa?
I haven't heard that name now, but I'm looking
really?
forward to it.
Oh, you need to look Elsa up. So Elsa made a movie called Taming Wild. Okay. And she gave herself 12 months to train a Mustang with no tools, no flags, no ropes, no whips, no tarps, no treats, no nothing. I would say, from what I know, is she would be the world's leading expert on relationship. But well, she calls it, what does she call it? It's not relationship-based training. Freedom-based training is what it's
Freedom-based.
And the lady is absolutely amazing. But she had a Pirelli background before she did that. I think she might have been an instructor. Anyway, so they all came and presented over 3 days, and the energy there was off the charts. And I don't mean you felt like you were at a rock concert type energy, but for me, the floor felt like it was shifting, like vertigo, except it wasn't in your head, it was in your feet. When I was announcing one of the guests there, I mentioned that, and half the room put their hand up and said, "We've been feeling it for days." It was the strangest. It was the strangest weekend I've ever had. Just all the crazy synchronicities that were happening, and yeah, it was pretty amazing. So we're having another one this year in San Antonio. We're actually having one in Australia as well, and we'd like to have one in the UK next year too. So, but yeah, they're pretty fun stuff.
No, it's wonderful. And that, as we get ready to close, one of the things that I do want to connect into is the work that we're doing in the International Horsemanship Foundation. On the pre-call, you met Dr. Jill Holmes, the veterinarian, and she's very interested in connecting science and horsemanship. I know we haven't had enough time on the call to go it, and I'm going to invite you back because I want to go down the path on the mammalian, we call it the mammalian nervous system.
Yeah.
Tremendous information on that you got, and how you can apply it, which just mind-boggling stuff when you and I talked about it. So let's get you back to talk about that. But back to where this concept that Dr. Jill Holmes has is that she'd like to connect the people who are doing science, like the Jennifer Zelig and those, to the practitioners like David Lichman and you. And then can we somehow, through a community, can we raise the game for the entire industry? And so Jill was very excited to get to meet you, because I gave her that hint that when I told her, talking about this, Warwick said, "Well, I'm already doing something like that." And I think it's wonderful. And I think that another thing is, and I'm going to shift a little bit because this will all come back together. I had a conversation today with Anthony Linquata, who's our 30-year nonprofit guy that we hired to help us really operate the International Horsemanship Foundation like a nonprofit ought to be done. And he said to me, "Andrew, I'm looking at a bunch of data. I don't want to take through all the detail, but essentially we have a small group. There's a small group of people that are doing this." Now, part of it was because we had the Pirelli Foundation name. So even if we weren't intentional about being only with Pirelli, people thought we were, therefore we were kind of there. And now part of the idea of reaching out and expanding and calling it International Horsemanship Foundation and integrating with the IHF, which was already very, very inclusive, and they wanted to provide, they want to continue to provide services for people who want to be great and to increase this wonderful horsemanship around the world, right? Anthony said, "We have a small group." And I said, "Well, it's kind of consistent with the market share that I believe we have in the world for relationship-based horsemanship." But I really like it because it kind of connects it to the animal trainers. But our market share in the world maybe is 5 or 10% of the world's horses and humans being together. And so part of what my personal mission, because of the good feeling that it's, you can tell we've talked about all through the night about how this has been life-changing for my wife, our horses, and then my career, all these things, right? Is, can we do something as an industry group to increase that number worldwide? And so when we think about then Dr. Hollenbeck, what he's all about, he wants to really raise the bar on how equine assisted therapy is delivered, because he's having such great success with the veterans and soldiers, reducing the rate of soldiers and vet suicide rate. And if we could reproduce what he's doing, right? So we've got some really kind of pretty bold initiatives that we want to do in this IHF, the International Horsemanship Foundation. And you're already doing some of it. So one of the things I was really hoping is to do, and we talked about it a little, is to partner with you, because obviously you're on to, I mean, I think you're going to just get bigger. I think that more people are going to connect to you, and it's because of this, you're really seeing it from the human perspective, and the humans are needing this. Do you have any suggestions based on what I've said? And I've talked to you about the concepts of what we're trying to do in the nonprofit. Do you have any advice for us, or anything that you'd like to suggest, or how can we partner better with you?
You know what, you had kind of asked me that question, like you sent me a list of questions before we, earlier today or yesterday.
The prep call, yeah.
And one of them, that question's probably a little bit different than I thought it was, but what I thought the question was how do we change people's minds? How do you, and I think that 5 or 10% is a gross overestimation, because if you've really been out there in the horse world, it's a scary place. But I thought the question was, how do you bring people around to this way of thinking? And for me, my answer to that sort of thing, I have a lot of people go, at my boarding facility, there's this lady and she's got this horse and she does this thing with it. How do I tell her she's doing it wrong? And I said, you do not. Exactly. You lead by example. You do what you do with your horses, and I saw a sign in a Western store one time said the best sermons are lived and not preached. And I really, I really think it's about sharing what we do rather than telling people that they're doing it wrong or they should be doing it differently or whatever. Because I don't think that ever converts anybody. And like this country, like say the political landscape in this country, I don't think anybody from the left has ever convinced anybody from the right that they're doing it wrong by telling them how wrong they're doing it. And I don't think anybody from the right's convinced anybody from the left to change what they're doing by telling them how wrong they do it. I think you've got to, and it comes down to like working with horses too. It comes down to working on connection. It comes down to working on relationship, and then you build from there. But as far as I'm kind of in a position to where I'm trying to do, I have, somewhat of a large social media following and stuff like that. So I'm trying to use that to share what I'm doing. And if people find it interesting, they can. And that, that social, I don't know how much you're on social media, but social media is a very, it's a strange creature, that one, to where, yes, it's a hard space to occupy if you are doing anything that's out of the ordinary. But anyway, I'm rambling here. So I can't really advise you guys how to do things differently, but I do think leading by example and, changing the life of one horse at a time is a good place to start. And, especially if you're, like I have a large social media following, so I can influence a large number of people. If you can influence the one person who keeps their horse stalled next to yours at your boarding facility by doing what you do and doing it well and making a difference there, I mean, I think everybody's in a different situation as far as how we can, change how others view stuff like this. But I think that the big thing is you've just got to run your own race and
Wonderful.
not try to preach too much.
Well, and I've heard this said a couple of times. It's one relationship at a time, and then one of the things that happens is when that relationship goes well, maybe that relationship goes and increases another one, and so
Well,
we have a ripple effect, right?
yeah. See, that's the thing. It's not up to you or me or whatever to change everybody's mind, but if you can help somebody see things a bit differently, then they're going to help somebody see things a bit differently, and they're going to help somebody see, like the sound tech guy at the Horse Expo in New Zealand. I'm sure he knows other guys who are struggling with their mental health a bit, and what he picked up from me talking about horses and mental health and stuff like that weekend, he might be saving a life somewhere else. So it's I think we've really got to look at it in you've really got to look at it in that way, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, look, it's been an amazing night. I knew it would be because, I've been hearing about you. I know we're going to have to schedule really quick to get you back as soon as we can, because we just barely touched some of the amazing things that you and I talked about. But we're on this journey together. And I think there's a lot of people on this call, because the people who do stick it out and watch our hour-and-a-half show that's completely about the revolution, it's very educational, it's intellectual, are really all in on this. And you're definitely a leader in this. It's amazing to be able to have you as a partner, even no matter how distant or together we are, because you're on this path of, it's about the relationship, changing people's lives. Miss Dr. Hollenbeck wants to reduce the suicide rate of soldiers and veterans. That was something that, I could get attention of a 2-star general or a 3-star general when I went to Washington, D.C., when I said, hey, would you be interested if we could talk about reducing the suicide rate? All ears from a 2-star general on the short guy from California in the tie, when I was talking about something. And the thing is, the follow-up, we have a lot of work to do to follow up to get that, because we know we've got something here that the world needs. But you're leading the way, and we thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for being willing to give your journey and your podcast and let people be a part of it. You're way ahead of me in terms of getting to know a lot of people who are influencers in the area. So I get to look at your podcast and what you're doing. And thank you for being our partner tonight. And there's all kinds of wonderful things that are being said. I want to just hit a couple of quotes, especially, Jill, our new president, our veterinarian from North Carolina. Thank you for the solid advice to lead by example. Great advice for individuals and nonprofits as well.
Can I just interrupt you?
Yeah, please do.
It's interesting. Dr. Jill was saying that she's interested in, the science and the empiric sort of stuff going together. And it's funny, you said you grew up, religious, and now you're into manifesting. And it's like these days, the science and the science and religion are coming together to figure out, we're learning there's a middle ground, and one explains the other one. They're not separate, they're the same, and one just explains it in a different way. Sorry to interrupt there, but I was thinking about Dr. Jill before.
Spot on. Nancy Koser said, I've personally been following Warwick for some time. He's beyond amazing. I so admire his journey. I'm impressed that the IHF is wanting to connect with this inspirational man. He's wise, has so much to offer. The IHF is on the right track. Thank you for that. We really do want to be on the right track. Listen to what he's telling you. Please bring him back. He was so much to offer for the world of horsemanship. Thank you for that comment, Nancy. Really do. Thank you for helping to change the world and for people and horses. This stuff is so transformational, Lena says. Applying the concepts to adjust some of the approaches and even staff trainings in large mental health nonprofits that I work for has resonated so much and is definitely making a difference. So on behalf of that, all the people involved in the International Horsemanship Foundation, the people around the world that are watching either live or watching this on tape, thank you so much for your time and your attention, those of you watching, but also thank you so much for being such a wonderful contributor to this revolution. We so appreciate you, Warwick Schiller. Do you have anything else you'd like to say before we go?
No, just thank you so much for having me on here, and you guys that are already, part of this IHF thing. I think you guys know where I'm coming from. This stuff is it's the way to go, and it's life-changing.
Wonderful. Hey, everybody. I'm going to close the show with "May the horse be with you." Thank you so much, and have a great